So to try and summarize my paper, I think I'll start this way. What I understand moral knowledge to be for these purposes, I take it we're not being too philosophically scrupulous about exactly what counts as knowledge, but it seems to me for our purposes, I understand it to be something more like some systematic, grounded body, a teachable body of beliefs that would be responsive to the very practical question, how should I live? Or in the sort of collective version, how should we live together? So that's where I want to start with, what moral knowledge would be, what we may have lost in some respects, what we might be seeking to recover. And I try to say at the beginning that I don't think it's helpful to me in this context, or others for that matter, to think of morality as I said, almost like some entity, some non-natural, or maybe partly entity that we're trying to figure out. Do we know it through intuition? Do we know it through this? Exactly as if it were some discrete thing. It's a much more, I think we're concerned with a much more practical question. How should we live? How should we live together? And how can we come up with ways of responding to those questions? So the next point I try to make is that in trying to respond to the question, how should I live? I think we necessarily have to acknowledge that our answers are going to depend on what we think we are, what kind of beings or what we are, and also what kind of life or world do we live in. I think that's sort of unavoidable. I give the example, if you're a 19-year-old, let's say, and you're trying to decide how should I live, meaning at this point maybe you've just graduated from high school or something, you don't know whether to go to college, you don't get a job, just have a good time. You have to, it seems to me, you have to think about questions like, who am I? What am I? What am I good at? What do I enjoy? What provides fulfillment to me? And also, what kind of life am I anticipating? Do I have another 50 years, another 70 years? Is there some reason to think I only have another 1 year? The answers that you give to how you should live will depend greatly on those kinds of questions. Now, you might not always bring them up explicitly. You might just think, well, let's see, how many years do I have to live? You might just go in with the assumption that you have another 50 years or something like that. But nonetheless, your answer will have to be affected by things like that. Without bringing things like that in, it just really wouldn't be possible to give any intelligent answer to the question about how you should live. If you just have a year to go, you're just not going to have the same answers as if you have, another 50 years and so forth. So if you generalize from that analogy to, humanity in general, I don't think we can really intelligently talk about morality, how we should live, without asking about what kind of beings are we? Is our life confined to this, mortal sphere? Is there some sort of purpose, in life? Is there some larger purpose in the whole thing? I just don't think it's possible to ask how we should live without having assumptions and beliefs about those kinds of things. And if we think instead that we can just ask, what is good or what is moral without reference to those things, I just think that's kind of a futile quest. Okay, so with those sorts of clarifications, I should say also, those kinds of questions, then it seems to me, are questions that we think of as religious questions. Is there some purpose in life? What kind of beings are we? And so forth. The kinds of answers that people might give to them aren't necessarily religious answers. Obviously someone might answer those questions by saying, let's say from a purely like scientific naturalist view, we're evolved beings with capacities for pleasure, a certain capacity for rational decision making, etc. When we die, and period. That could be the framework that somebody adopted, for addressing the question of how we should live. But nonetheless, those are the questions. The questions themselves tend to be sort of religious questions. Is there meaning in life? Is there some larger purpose, and that sort of thing. Now, I also think it's true, and I think certainly the book points this out over and over eloquently, that we do live in, I think, morally confused and somewhat unmoored times. But it's not because there's not a lot of moralizing and so forth going on. There's a great deal of it, I think. Much of it is sort of unmoored. But in fact, there are, I think, communities that have moral knowledge. They have a shared body of beliefs, teachable beliefs, that are responsive to the question about how we should live. I suspect that most of us in this room, are affiliated in some way with a community that probably has, that kind of moral knowledge, I think. So it's not that moral knowledge has, disappeared from the world or anything of that sort. There's still quite a lot of it around. And more generally, within sort of a Christian perspective or an Orthodox Jewish perspective, or for that matter, a Marxist or just a free market economic perspective, you can have, I think, very productive moral discussions about how people should live, because there are a lot of shared assumptions, about what's valuable, about what we're trying to achieve, what kind of beings we are, and so forth. But a lot of that doesn't carry over into our public institutions, and that it seems like Dallas Willard was, in this book, really concerned with publicly accessible moral knowledge, and that's what isn't being, what we don't seem to have anymore, and that's what isn't being taught, and so forth. A lot of the moral knowledge that we have in our various communities doesn't carry over into our institutions, and a lot of it doesn't carry over into law, which is my discipline and what I'm supposed to be writing about here. So why would there, if there's moral knowledge out there, why is there not much moral knowledge in our public discourse, and for me, in law and in sort of legal culture? And my suggestion is, the reason is that we sort of deliberately screen it out. We self-consciously make an effort to ensure that the moral knowledge that this community has or that community has will not really, be accepted and taught in our public discourse, and in particular in law. There's a qualification to that I'll make in a minute, but I'll start by saying that. We screen it out either, in some sort of justice philosophy, a Rawlsian political philosophy or whatever, that would say that for making public decisions, we shouldn't rely upon comprehensive doctrines, various provisos and so forth, but I don't think, we want to worry too much about that for our purposes. The basic goal is to screen comprehensive doctrines out of public justification, public discourse. Or in constitutional law, I think it gets screened out by the assumption that all of our laws have to be serving secular purposes. Secular is a pretty loose and undefined term for the most part, but it's understood intuitively to mean not religious or not sectarian purposes. So that kind of understanding gets screened out, I think, of our constitutional discourse and a lot of our public discourse. Not altogether, obviously, there are radio talk shows and so forth. People can still quote the Bible, etc. We can do that kind of thing. But for purposes of public justification, it gets screened out. So I try to give the example of litigation. There was a lot of it, of course, in recent years about marriage, and whether there can be any rational basis, constitutional requirement for traditional marriage laws. And in trying to defend laws of that kind, I think the lawyers, the legal scholars, the judges, everybody kind of understood that they couldn't say anything about the Bible teaches or marriage is a sacrament or anything of that sort. They were limited to justifications like well, it won't be good for children, or things of that sort, which are important claims in themselves and so forth. But it was a much more limited kind of discourse that was brought to bear. And the suspicion, often explicitly expressed, sometimes explicitly expressed by judges, was even though you guys are making these arguments about children, and social, we know that underlying your position is really some sort of religious view, and we know that can't count for public justification, and so we're going to invalidate the traditional marriage law for that sort of reason. Nonetheless, law and public discourse still has to make a lot of decisions about how we should live together. It can't avoid the moral question, so how does that happen? And simplifying, obviously, quite a bit, it seems to me that in law, and law carries over into a lot of public discourse, so it's not just lawyers, really, that we're talking about. There have been two main strategies for trying to answer moral questions without relying upon the kind of moral knowledge that many of us have, I think, or believe we have. One, both of them try to find a common denominator so that they won't be sectarian. One of them you might think of as the consequentialist strategy, which says, well, whatever our beliefs, we all have certain interests or preferences, and so we all have an interest in satisfying our preferences as efficiently as possible. And so we should just make public decisions by factoring our preferences into some sort of preference or utility calculus and doing that. And so that's a common approach. Law and economics would be, very pervasive in our discipline. And but public choice theory, rational choice theory, in lots of ways, I think that's kind of the assumption. The other is more of a justice-oriented approach that would be, again, typified by something like a Rawlsian commitment to public reason. We make our decisions not just on, grubby utilitarian considerations, but in accordance with justice, equality, etc., but in accordance with public reason. And so that, I think, is the exception when I mentioned that law doesn't have any moral knowledge. Actually, I think people who are proponents either of law and economics or of like Rawlsian justice feel perfectly free in their classes and in their writing to bring that kind of moral knowledge in, to teach it, to try to impart it to students and so forth. And I don't actually mean to denigrate either of those approaches altogether. I mean, I think they do have their valuable uses. Certainly the economics approach does have its valuable uses and so forth. But I suggest in the paper that these things either mistranslate or fail to capture a lot of our most important normative convictions. A lot of our normative convictions are just not reducible either to, I have a preference for this, or when you come to the public reason part and say the whole strategy is to exclude our deepest normative convictions. So it's a kind of an anti-normative normativity, one in which our moral discourse will be one that's very self-consciously against bringing in or allowing in, for purposes of justification, a lot of our deepest normative convictions. And that, I think, is basically, these are common strategies. There's actually a lot more to say about some of them, but page limits and time limits and so forth, how the justice and equality part works, I think, is, I'll just say just a little bit more. I'd say the justice sort of discourse often consists of either or both of two things, and these are just pervasive, I think. One is using the concept of equality, which is a bit of an explanation about, Peter Weston wrote an article years ago about the empty concept of equality, but using it as a sort of basis for smuggling in values that aren't necessarily openly acknowledged, or a kind of discourse, I sometimes call it the jurisprudence of denigration, of attributing animus or hatred or evil motives to those that we disagree with. These are the first one is question begging, I think. The second one is actually quite destructive of any kind of moral knowledge, real moral knowledge, or viable discourse. And yet it's quite understandable, I think, why these kinds of arguments are so common. It's because once you screen out all of people's real normative convictions, there's not much left except to either smuggle things in or to attribute bad motives to your opponents, because we can still all agree that acting from hatred is probably not a good thing. And so I think that's a reason why this kind of discourse is so common. But it is polarizing, it is destructive, and it tends to dissolve or screen out the kind of moral knowledge that we have. That, I think, is our situation today. Now, we were also asked to talk, and we have been talking about what to do about this, and I have less to say about that. In most of my work, I've always tried to avoid prescribing anything, just be purely critical or descriptive or diagnostic, but, when you come to prescriptions, you usually get in trouble and so forth, and I do have a reservation about that. But we were asked to say something about it, so I'll just quickly say three things on this, and I try to mention these in the paper itself. The first is that I'm not confident that there is really any, I'll say, purely human answer or strategy for dealing with our situation. I was remembering this morning when I was an undergraduate at Brigham Young University, I heard a talk, and I was trying to remember, and I may have conflated my memories here. I'm thinking it was by someone named Charles Malik or something, but I'm also thinking that he was the president of the American University in Beirut or something, and okay, anyway, he talked about how basically secularization, how in this talk, how the world's become really secular and God's been kind of screened out of it. And someone asked the sort of natural question at the end. They said, well, so what do we do about this? How do we bring God back? I think, and someone phrased the question almost like that. And the speaker said, God will come back if he wants to. We don't have the power to bring God back and so forth, So I take that as sort of a cautionary point. I mean, it doesn't relieve us of the obligation to do what we can, I think. So, we still need to pursue these sorts of things. But I think we also need to be sort of humble and realize, we don't have control over a lot of this, a lot's beyond our control. With that caution, two other points. One is it might seem like, given my diagnosis, that the answer would be to try and remove the barriers that are screening moral knowledge out of our public discourse. I mean, if I say, actually, there's a lot of it out there, it's just that we don't allow ourselves to use it, and they say, well, just knock down those obstacles. And I think that that's a good thing to do, to try to do, for various reasons. For one is the obstacles, I think, are not really justified in most cases. They don't really come legitimately from the Constitution and so forth. So I think that's a good thing to try to do. And in a lot of my work, I think I do sort of try to do that, undermine them somewhat. But I don't have much confidence either that will happen, or that the result would be particularly momentous or anything. I think by now these kinds of constraints are so internalized in a lot of our culture that even if, as I say, even if the Supreme Court said, we were wrong, there's really nothing wrong with actually studying the Bible in schools and even quoting it, as a public justification. By now, in much of the population, it would be such a suspect source or something that it's not clear that you would really even gain much by trying to do that. Not a reason not to try, I think, but I'm just not too hopeful that there's much to be gained there. So the other, and this is the final point, seems to me like the more promising approach is just to try to do what we can to protect and strengthen the communities of moral knowledge that we have, because they're under threat too, I think, from law and culture and in other ways. And so, in the area of law, things like church autonomy doctrine or free exercise exemptions, or in one way or another, these are ways that I think we can try to use to, again, protect the communities that we have, the communities of moral knowledge and belief, which then hopefully would be, as I suggest, at least maybe a kind of leaven for society, and maybe even a kind of light, that, as things get bad in other places, people might be able to look to the communities that are functioning and see, there's actually something there and so forth. That might, to me, be the best hope for things that we could do, or at least in law, to try to preserve and maybe even to some extent restore a kind of moral knowledge, at least to have some kind of influence on our public discourse. So anyway, that's, so that's where I tentatively end with the paper. Thanks. So.